If we are wrong, we shall find out by ourselves. Just the way we don't interfere with yours.
If the European Union's own human rights reporting found serious violations, surely that demands a bit of a rethink on the strategy, the development partnership that we've been discussing.
The conceptual West convinced us that our salvation could only come from something they call democracy, and I'm using the word very deliberately, something they call democracy, which they defined. And they defined it in English, if you are colonized by the English, and they defined it in French, if you are colonized by the French, and they defined it in Portuguese, if you are colonized by the Portuguese, and they defined it in Spanish, if you are colonized by the Spaniard. We never defined it in Kinyarwanda. No. It was never defined in Igbo or Yoruba. And we who have had the advantage, if it is an advantage at all, of being educated in the West, there is a sense in which our thought processes are also confined by those definitions. However much we want to free ourselves, we find our default mode being how we were trained. So when we define democracy, we are also caught up in this box. In many African nations today, after every election, whether we like it or not, we have observers. And when the elections are being held, observers may come from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Uganda, but people are waiting. What did the European Union say? You know, this belief by us that the Europeans have a divine duty to tell us what to do, and we have a divine duty to accept to do what they say, is one of the problems that we have. And until the day that we liberate ourselves to decolonize our minds, in a manner of speaking, we are going to embrace the kind of politics that will only perpetuate conflict.
Gotcha. I'm going to ask you this question, however, because there are a lot of criticism of the kind of debt distress or debt burden that China is potentially imposing on its African partners. For instance, just earlier this year, according to media reports, there is this port project in Bagamoyo, which is supposed to have been put on halt by your court or by your president, saying that the Chinese is using exploitive or unfair terms in terms of lending to Tanzania. How do you react to that? I mean, as Chinese, I understand, of course, there are cases, right, where there are companies or there are individuals or that are probably not operating on the soundest business terms. But how do you look at these frictions in the relationship between the two sides?
No, we have no frictions.
Not even frictions.
Differences of perception are not differences. So one, I would want to correct your question. You are using an example which is not appropriate in the case of that
because
that
the Western media, for instance,
that
Reuters,
is the Western media. You are
because Reuters, for instance, is quoting this as a very important story, talking about the kind of obstacle that
and it's very good you are saying it is Reuters. It's very good you are saying it is Reuters. First of all, this is not the first time China is being accused of such pretentious fabrications. In the 1960s, China was portrayed in the same manner. And it is on 26th of February 1965 in Beijing, where our founding father of the nation, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, told the world, nobody should choose friends for us or enemies for us. China, we have chosen China to be our friend, and time will tell. And indeed, at that time China was not even a member of the UN. And Tanzania is one of those countries which fought hard, campaigned hard in the UN to make sure that China is restored back in the UN and that it regains its seat in the Security Council. So such examples which the Reuters is saying, they do not reflect the unique, special relationship between Tanzania and China. And that relationship, this unique, special, all-weather relationship is guaranteed. Differences of perceptions, difference of opinions in one or two things may happen, but that does not mean Tanzania is taking China as a colonial power. On the question of debt trap, again, it is not true what is being portrayed. Africa has borrowed more from the World Bank. Africa has borrowed more from Europe. And if you look at the aggregate of the loans we have borrowed from World Bank and Europe, they are far more than what we have borrowed from China. But what is important, no country in the world has developed without borrowing. The big powers are borrowing.
Yeah.
I want to believe also China is borrowing. What is important, you borrow that money to do and do what? We borrowed from China to build the infrastructure. We borrowed from China to build the hydroelectric power stations, to generate electricity. We borrowed from China to do many other projects. So for me, the perception of Reuters, which wants to believe there's a friction between Tanzania and China, is not only fallacious, but is part of the Western propaganda, which has been there from the 1960s to today. So I wouldn't want to associate myself with such kind of propaganda, not because it is propaganda, but because it wants to deter us and remove us from the focus of enhancing our bilateral cooperation, which, as I said, is unique and all-weather.